Hey, you all, it's Travis. All I have with me is my coffee. No dog. She's having her little sleep back in the bedroom on Sunday nights. Sometimes she's my couch buddy on Sunday nights, but tonight she's sleeping back in the bedroom. I'm just going to review my sermon from this morning. So I'm going to try to not worry about the time on this too much. And try to keep this as casual as I possibly can. But I was doing Acts 27. Now, so far in Acts, what we've seen is this, and what I've picked up on is a lot of conversation and recording of authority, about holding to God's authority, facing authority that is really ultimately worldly authorities, and how, particularly with Paul, how God pulled him through, and Jesus came to Paul and gave him a prophecy that said that he would go to Rome. And that may have seemed unlikely, but it did happen. And then when you get to Acts 27, this is where you have the shipwreck. And I noticed some pretty interesting things going on here. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about all aspects of the sermon, but I would like to talk about some things that I did notice that were really interesting. So Paul is a prisoner, and I would like to actually read you this passage. It says, this is verse 4. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing from Italy and put us on board. And so here, okay, so the centurion's in charge of the prisoners, okay, and in charge of Paul. And it's getting late in the season. And so Paul says, guys, it's probably not a good idea that we go sailing. We may want to hold up here. And they don't listen to him. Probably reasonably so, actually. You had these sailors and the pilot, instead of the centurion listened to the sailors and the pilot. That probably made a lot of sense. This is your prisoner, right? I mean, I don't see that to be too odd of a thing. And then things get bad enough to where they start taking the cargo and throwing it overboard. And it said there was no sun came out for a long time. Now, this is game over, man. I mean, game over. They're trust me, if you're on you start seeing these things happen, and you're witnessing the waves and everything. I imagine you're thinking it's over. And Paul reports that he was visited by an angel. Luke doesn't talk about it. He just talks about what Paul says. Paul says he was visited by an angel, and he says, the angel assured me that we're not going to lose any life, because Paul had told them earlier that they would lose lives. But God assured him that would not happen. Now, at this point, we were talking about authorities, right? When things get this bad, Paul has now made himself an authority, because what hope do they have outside of what Paul's offering? None. They don't have any hope. Now, despite this, okay, this is where you start to see I referenced, let me sidetrack real fast here and reference Psalm 23, where it says, you will make a place, set a table for me among my enemies. And that is exactly what's happening to Paul here. He is now gone from a prisoner that they're not going to listen to an authority figure among them. And Paul, though, despite getting a prophecy from God, does not abandon common sense. At some point, it gets so bad, it said that the sailors started to get concerned that they were going to run aground. So they go to get on the dinghy and get out of there. They're going to abandon ship. And Paul looks at the soldiers and at the centurion, he says, if you let these guys go, we're done. We're not going to survive. So they need the experience of the sailors, and they need the sailors to need to live while being completely in the same boat, both literally and figuratively, as them. So the soldiers go up and they cut the dinghy loose. And this forces the sailors to fight for their lives to keep everyone alive. Very interesting. I love how it just, Paul still has to do practical things. He has to be pragmatic. And this is something that, a lot of people that want to question Christianity, they want to put us in situations and paradigms where it's like, well, if you have atheists filling sandbags and Christians praying, which one would you want? Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because despite that, just as a misunderstanding of basic theology, we don't abandon practical concerns, even if God gives us a prophecy. Paul, visited by an angel, clear prophecy, and yet, no, it does the thing that's at hand to do, and so continues along. But I thought it was really interesting that that he wouldn't listen to Paul earlier, and now he has to listen to Paul. And Paul even says, you should have listened to me earlier, guys, when I said we shouldn't go out in the storm, but okay, here's what we're going to do now. So things get bad, and I want to read this last part to you because it's really good. All right. It says, now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stem was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on the planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Now, I do think you want to be careful when it comes to allegory here. But I'll say as a note, these were prisoners that were now told, you're just swim for your life. And they were rescued from they would have been within their rights to execute these prisoners, but they were released. Again, be careful, very careful with allegory, but it does seem maybe that it's pointing to the gospel here. But take that one with a grain of salt with that interpretation. But I will say this, authoritatively, Paul has now won favor with his enemies. Well, God won him favor with his enemies. And here's where we get to our final point here. I think it's really interesting. Paul's presence among them was a blessing to them. Just like I talked about in the past, what we read in Corinthians 13, where, love, the more love you can give to others, the closer you are to being godly. So seek the gifts that are closer to being more loving and more godly. And Paul lists apostleship as number one on the list of things that are towards being more loving. And he's living it out. Luke is showing us here in Acts that he lived this out. They were being blessed by Paul's presence. I think that's something that we can really strive for as Christians. We can ask God to show us how we can be a blessing to others. I know that you hear these kind of messages all the time in American Christian churches, but in this case, I'm hoping that it really sticks in Acts, that this is something that we should be striving for. You and I know I can speak for myself. I can't speak for anybody else, but I know that I have not perfected this. But I want it to really stick in my mind and in my heart that, hey, God can bless others with my presence, even if they're my enemies. And so it puts a little bit of a twist on Psalm 23 as well. In Psalm 23, it says, "You set for me a table among my enemies." And that psalm is about how when things look their bleakest, God is there guiding him, and he even gives him more, puts him in a place with his enemies, where his enemies are even hospitable to him, which I think is what's going on there. But he also could be a blessing to his enemies. And we could do that too. And we see that with Paul. He has a place among them, but he also is giving them a major blessing just by being there. All right, I won't ramble on that, but I think that'd be a good thing to focus on and to pray about this week. Talk to you again soon.